Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ 102.1, where we challenge the assumptions of our current society to resist oppression and investigate alternative ways of living, for a world based on justice, solidarity and sustainability. Welcome to The Paradigm Shift on 4ZZZ. It's great to have you listening. It is your local community radio station. It belongs to us to create the media that we want and need for the betterment of all us listeners, rather than the advertisers who run most of the media out there and the profiteers that own them. Not this one. My name's Andy, and I'll be hanging out with you for the next hour. We are broadcasting on Jagera and Turrbal country, and today on the show we are going to be talking about Julian Assange. It is a topic that we've covered a bit over the years, but it's certainly an injustice that has dragged on for a number of years now, and that affects one person who is still locked up in Belmarsh Maximum Security Prison in London, even though he currently is not serving any sentence for anything. He's just being held there while the US attempts to extradite him to their country to charge him with their laws, which he supposedly broke, even though he was not living in the US at the time. And so it affects Julian, but affects all of us, because ultimately it was an act. The US persecution of Julian Assange was and is an act that is designed to scare people off telling truths that are uncomfortable for big empires. And in that way, it's a warning to all people who might be willing to share with the public important truths. But it's also a persecution of the public's right to know the truth. You know, it's a war on truth tellers, but it's also a war on the truth just as a concept. And so that's what is at stake in the Julian Assange case, and that's why we've been returning to it over the years and trying to show solidarity with Julian Assange where we can. And today on the show, we're going to continue to do that. I've got two interviews. One is with John Shipton, who is Julian Assange's father, and also has been a very staunch advocate of his for the time of his imprisonment and his various forms of being locked up in the Ecuadorian embassy before he was put into prison there. And we'll also speak to Kym Staton, who is the director of a brand new film. The film is called The Trust Fall, and it's a documentary about Julian Assange. And so I spoke to Kym about it. But by the end of this show, you will be up to speed on what's happening with Julian and the importance of supporting him. So just a brief kind of introduction before I go on. His next court date is February 20. It will be his final appeal against extradition to the US. The extradition has already been granted by the UK courts, and so this is Julian and his legal team appealing against it. And so that will be the final hearing. After that, there is one more kind of recourse they have, which will be to go to the European Court of Human Rights. If you don't know who Julian Assange is, well, he started an organisation called WikiLeaks back a long, long time ago. in around about 2008, 2009, I think it started. And they basically, what it was a platform where people could anonymously release information that they thought was in the public interest, and then WikiLeaks would make it available. It was when encrypted technology was much less common than it is now, and so this was quite radical, a way to safely leak information without having your identity revealed. After a number of different leaks, a US soldier called Chelsea Manning, released a vast amount of classified US information, some of which was diplomatic cables about how the US related to other countries that were quite revealing about empires and how they work in the world today, and it was a lot of information about the Iraq War as well that included this famous footage of a US helicopter gunning down journalists and then passers-by who stopped to try to help those journalists. And so the US took great offence to this. The person who leaked it was later caught, Chelsea Manning, and then through Chelsea, WikiLeaks have been persecuted, and Julian Assange is being prosecuted for that and facing up to 175 years in prison if he is found guilty in the US, which numerous high-profile American politicians have already said they believe he's guilty, and so who knows whether he will have a fair trial there. And so that is why Julian has been resisting extradition for a long time. Even before there was a formal extradition request, Julian hid in the Ecuadorian embassy to avoid being arrested in the UK, believing that this extradition request was imminent, which it probably was. So that's why we are speaking up for him, supporting him, and we'll hear more through the course of the show. I did speak this morning to Julian's father, John Shipton, to get some updates on the case and, I guess, insights into the man and how he's doing. Let's have a listen to John.
My name is John Shipton. I'm Julian Assange's father, and we've been on the trail of Julian's freedom for about 11 years now, but the last since he was put in Belmarsh prison and the threat of extradition to the United States became at crisis point, we now have been working sort of flat out since 2019.
Julian's next big date in this saga will be February 20 with his final appeal against extradition to the US. I guess, what's that looking like, and how is his legal team feeling about it?
You know, I don't know. Over the years, these interminable court cases, maybe 30 now, I lost count at 23. The lawyers often speak optimistically. I don't think they go into these things, looking at their shoes. They look at the horizon. So, I take no notice whatsoever of the legal people or lawyers that are engaged. I speak to lawyers who aren't engaged for some guidance through the minefield of laws. If this is refused, so Julian's application presently is for a hearing, that is, to get permission to have an appeal hearing. If they say no, that means that Julian must immediately appeal to the European Court of Human Rights to prevent his extradition to the United States. His lawyer, Jen Robinson, made a statement the other day where she said clearly and firmly that the danger of Julian's suicide, if extradited to the United States, was very high. Now, this was a conclusion brought to notice in the hearing 3 years ago by Professor Coleman, who is a consulting psychiatrist equally brought to public notice by Nils Melzer, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture and Unusual Punishment, who made the cryptic observation that we are watching a slow-motion murder.
Yeah, many of us are concerned for Julian's well-being, but you do have more contact with him than most of us. So could you share with us how he's doing and how he's holding up in there?
It's a question I don't like, I'm asked it thousands of times. What am I going to say? How am I going to think about this? It's 14 years now of one form of incarceration or another in one medieval dungeon after the next, until eventually landing in Belmarsh maximum security prison. Nils Melzer, the United Nations Rapporteur on Torture, with two specialist doctors who diagnosed in their report to the United Nations, said that Julian was suffering the effects of psychological torture. That must be sufficient understanding for all of us that you don't fare well after 14 years of incessant smearing, calumnies, lies, court case after court case, suspension of due process, the collapse of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all of your human rights disobeyed, and really, a very, very difficult question for me to answer without feeling enraged, angry, and bordering on emotional violence. Emotional violence, what I mean by that is to start calling people names. What I mean by names is this: the Australian government, until the present government, was silent. That silence is acquiescence. Over a period of time, acquiescence becomes complicity. That is my government. 4 of the 5 governments that have been in power, 4 of the 5 prime ministers and foreign ministers have been complicit, assisting the United States of America in the persecution of my son Julian Assange and the Australian citizen Julian Assange, who is lauded all over the world for his capacity to courageously simply speak the truth. No falsifications, no fibs, no lies, but just the simple truth. And that truth brought to the public through American or United States documentation. What am I supposed to think?
Now, it's certainly been quite a journey since the release in 2010 of those US diplomatic cables and the collateral murder video. And yeah, it was a courageous act, but it certainly has had repercussions. How do you think Julian feels now about the release of that information and I guess the gains from it versus the costs?
Well, I don't know. I don't ask that sort of question, If you imagine that you're banged up for 14 years and you add to that the contemplation as you're 22 hours a day in your cell, the contemplation of regrets, you double down on the torture. So you begin to torture yourself. So I leave that out. I always speak in a different plane or a different tone to Julian. I just outline what we're doing and also some of the humorous ironies, and a bit of principally what we speak about is, his sister and his children and his brother and what we're doing, and mostly the richness of interpersonal family gossip is what I speak of.
Yes, well, there's been a couple of recent additions to the family in the last few years. Your grandkids and Julian's kids. What's that been like for the family, and how are they coping with it all?
They're creatures of joy, and their mother has an extended family, and they're all very close to each other. So they're embraced in an atmosphere of care and love. So they're doing all right. They're curious. They go to the jail to visit Julian. It has to be a Saturday because the regulations upon school attendance in the United Kingdom are very strict. So that is normality to them.
And Stella has also been a very powerful voice and staunch advocate for Julian. Has that been helpful for you after all these years of struggling as a kind of close supporter of Julian?
Oh, yes, yeah. Stella's terrific. And she has now a platform of her own and become very effective speaker and supporter and defender of her husband in Europe and the United Kingdom. Stella also is a fluent Spanish speaker, so her voice carries into Spain and South America as well.
Now, today on the show, I'm also going to be speaking to Kym, who's directed The Trust Fall, a documentary about Julian that you are in. And there was also recently the film Ithaca, made by your other son, Gabriel, about how the effect that it's had on your family. What do you think is the importance of these films and I guess other cultural representations of Julian?
As a very powerful politician in Germany once said to me, look, in Germany it didn't happen until it's in the newspapers. In the United States, Australia and New Zealand and Canada, it didn't happen until there's a documentary made about it. So, under that small understanding of the phenomenon of media, the films and cultural events of every sort, music, concerts, forums and art gallery shows, they're all very important. You can get an echoing pulse around the world from really good, firm events which celebrate the capacity of people to bring an injustice to an end.
Now, we've spoken a bit about this, the fact that there's been recent changes in the Australian government and the way it relates to Julian Assange. I mean, we have a Prime Minister now who said that he has spoken to Joe Biden about Julian Assange and requested that Assange be released, but also last year there was a group of politicians from across all the party spectrum in Australian Parliament that went to the US and met with the Department of Justice to make representations on behalf of Julian Assange. Do you feel like the current government is doing as much as it can for Julian?
Well, success is doing as much as it can. So as long as it's not successful, it's not doing as much as it can. Okay? That's pretty clear. The other next is the parliamentary delegation drawn from all of the political spectrum in Australia was magnificent. And now we have, after the visit to Washington, communion between the Australian Parliament and the Congress of the United States on the matter of Julian Assange, which will spread to other areas as people within the Congress and people within Parliament have established relationships with each other. These are really important. The other thing is that it's a substantial model for other concerns of the Australian electorate, for example, housing, or jobs, or free tertiary education, or dental care, or environmental degradation, to join together with like-minded politicians and social groups, to join together and actively pursue these important policies that have fallen into disuse over the years of neoliberalism in the last 40 years. There's aspects that are umbrella concerns across the entire electorate, and the Assange campaign is a demonstration or a model for which activist groups can bond together to improve the circumstances.
And what about for the rest of us who aren't politicians but who want to support Julian Assange? What do you think that the average person can be doing in the next month or so to show solidarity with Julian ahead of this court date?
Well, three things. Talk to each other. Listen to alternative media like your thing. And then just get together with a couple of people in the same electorate and go and see your parliamentarians, not by yourself, but just 3 or 2 or 4 or 5, and all go along and bring your concerns to the parliamentarian. That's what they're there for. They don't know our concerns unless we go and tell them. The newspapers have their own concerns, usually to sell more toothpaste or a car. But our concerns can be put into Parliament by going and telling your electoral member what your concerns are and say, we reckon that this is a bit on the nose. The man's been banged up for 14 years. He hasn't been charged with anything. There's no charges. It's medieval. Do something about it. And don't say, it's a matter of law. It's not a matter of law. The charges are political charges. It's extraterritorial. That means that it's not a matter of law, it's a matter of political application of another nation's laws to our citizen. There's plenty there that the parliamentarians can sincerely address and expand the Parliament's power and expand their support within the electorate. Pretty simple stuff, that the politicians have to understand. So rather than the current procedure of money, buy media space, and then get power, the best thing, the proper thing in my view, is to go to people and speak to them and find out what they want, or the people go to the parliamentarian.
Okay, thanks very much, John, for chatting with us today.
Thank you, Andy. You're very kind.
We were listening to John Shipton, who is Julian Assange's father and has been a very prominent and very dedicated advocate for Julian for the last decade and a half that he's been locked up in one way or another. And let's listen now to Kym Staton, the director of the new film The Trust Fall.
My name's Kym Staton. I'm the director and writer of the Trustful Julian Assange documentary, a filmmaker, poet and musician from northern New South Wales.
And the Trustful, it is having its premiere screening in Brisbane this coming week. I guess to start off with, I mean, there's been a few films about Julian Assange. Why did you feel the need to make this one?
Yeah, that's right. There's been around a dozen documentaries made on the topic, and some of them are really well done. But what my partner and I felt was a film that delves into the meaning of the situation, rather than another documentary that talks about the what and the when, the sort of strict chronological sequence. This film is actually about what we can learn from it, and what it all means, and what it means for future generations.
Well, without too many spoilers or anything, do you want to share a bit about what you think it does mean?
Yeah, well, I think this situation is primarily a scare campaign. It's a way of intimidating the world, especially journalists and whistleblowers. They've turned Julian into a scapegoat through this well-orchestrated campaign of smear, slander, lawfare, which is basically a form of warfare through the courts, and then all the confinement. For 13 years, they've been keeping Julian Assange in various conditions of imprisonment and reduced freedoms, and it's all to warn off future would-be whistleblowers from revealing the crimes of the powerful.
Well, in that case, I would guess, it is a campaign of fear, but I assume for making a documentary that you managed to get a variety of people to talk about it. How did you go trying to seek out people who are willing to be interviewed or be a part of the film?
We set on the mission to try to interview some of the most articulate, well-known, colourful characters, advocates of Julian Assange, and his family members and members of the WikiLeaks organisation. It was quite slow going at the beginning. Our first interview was with John Shipton, and I managed to get that through a contact that I had from a film that we'd streamed on our platform, the No Extradition documentary. So that helped to sort of get the wheels in motion. And then our second interview was with Tariq Ali, who's a famous historian and author in London. And once we had a few interviews down, it started to get a little bit easier. Those people gave us a little bit of help getting in touch with others, and I think also in the Assange campaign, the advocates of the campaign tend to be good friends, or at least know of each other, and that way that sort of helped to sort of connect with other interview subjects, and eventually we were interviewing the top people that we had on our list, and it was just an incredible privilege to interview the late John Pilger, who sadly passed away just around 10 days ago, Daniel Ellsberg, the legendary Pentagon Papers whistleblower, who also passed away earlier last year, and many other very articulate advocates. It was an amazing experience.
I assume you've made other films before. Are they similar, or is this a new branching out for you as a filmmaker?
Well, this is actually our first film. My first director role, and my lovely partner Natalia Mignana, it's her first role as producer, and we co-produced the film together. And we picked a nice, easy topic to work with.
One obstacle that you had as a filmmaker, I guess, is that the main subject of the film, you can't film, you can't take cameras into a prison. How did that go? And did you go in there? Did you have many conversations with Julian and plan out the film? Did he have any input or anything?
Well, yeah, you're right. Usually when you make a documentary, you can communicate with and typically you can film the topic, the subject of the film. In this case, we couldn't do that. Julian Assange has very little visitors. It's very restricted. It's only his family and lawyers, and occasionally, recently, there's been a few journalists able to visit. So I didn't make any requests to visit him, partly because we're in Australia as well, and when we started the film there was travel restrictions as well, so there's been all kinds of challenges. But even if I could visit him, I can't film him, so what we did to get around that, we've used animations to depict some of the stories and experiences that the interviewees have related. For example, Niels Melzer of the UN Spatial Rapporteur visited Julian, and there's a very touching, sad moment from his book, and we had that animated. And then there's a moment during the extradition trial where Julian was kept in a glass room at the back of the court, and we wanted to depict that, so we had that animated. So there's plenty of animations, more than you would typically find in a documentary. And I've certainly been in touch with his lawyers and his family for them to have input into the film, as well as our main advisor on the film, Juan Passarelli, who's made an excellent documentary about Assange as well, and has some incredible archive footage. And that's how we also have Julian have many appearances in the film, is actually through a lot of archive footage that was supplied, licensed or donated to us.
As well as the, I guess, intellectuals and journalists that you talked about interviewing, you do have a couple of famous musicians that came to be a part of the film, I understand. Roger Waters from Pink Floyd and MIA. How did they come to be involved, and what do you think is the importance of musicians in something like this? Well, for the narration, we were looking for some well-known voices, some expressive voices, some people that had demonstrated their support for Assange publicly, and so Roger Waters was one of the top of the list for potential narrators because he's so outspoken on the issue. And we managed to get in touch with him, and he just said, yeah, sure, of course. And same with MIA and Tom Morello. I wanted to have a mix of male and female voices, and also different accents. So we have Australian accent in there, and UK and American, because these are the countries that are involved in this persecution. So to sort of represent those accents was important. And I think when you have narrators that are either musicians or actors, they can have very expressive, colourful voices, and can be really good at bringing out a natural feeling and expression from the narration. Yeah, I guess with music and with film as well, there's some way these things are kind of the entertainment industry, but they're so linked to the way our culture tells stories and the way we shape culture. What do you hope comes of making this film?
We really want to just raise awareness all around the world, to educate people on this topic, bring them up to speed, help them to understand it. I think the big part of why this is going on, why Julian Assange is being scapegoated and is suffering, is a lack of awareness amongst the people. People find it hard to digest the topic and sort of really understand what it all means. And so it is an educational film, but it's also a story of it's tragic and shocking, and we want to open people's eyes to some of the crimes that have been revealed by WikiLeaks, so they can be informed and educated on that. And I think we really have to be willing to look at what's really going on in the world if we're going to rectify it and have a better future for everybody.
All right, thanks very much, Kym.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That is Kym Staton there, director of the new film The Trust Fall. And of course, as we said at the beginning of that interview, there are many other documentaries about Julian Assange as well. If you want to find out more, as well as books and all kinds of articles online, everything, and a number of Paradigm Shift shows over the years, actually. He does have his next court date coming up on February 20, and it's really getting down to the wire now. This is the final avenue of appeal against his extradition to the US. They will presumably go to the European Court of Human Rights if it fails, but it is looking very likely that he may go to the US and be tried for a number of crimes that have very serious maximum penalties. And as we've heard before, his mental health already is not in a very good state, as you would expect, given the circumstances. So there's plenty of opportunities for solidarity. I think you can write to Julian. I think it's quite difficult, actually, to get any contact to him. But I think certainly making sure that he's not forgotten, and the work that he's done, standing up for the truth, is not forgotten, is a big part of solidarity work. And I guess spreading the ideas of truth and government transparency, which is the whole reason why he's in there as well, continuing that work for him. And as John Shipton said, you can talk to politicians. I'm not always the big fan of talking to politicians most of the time myself, because there's so many other avenues by which we can affect political change as ordinary people without having to go and play the games of power that politicians are in. But in this case, there's not much we can do for Julian Assange as average people, but Australian politicians talking to the US can quite possibly get him returned to this country and get those charges dropped. So plenty of work anyway to do solidarity with him. And I will mention as well, Kieran O'Reilly, a Brisbane long-time activist. He's in the UK and he's doing a one-man solidarity effort. He is drawing other people in with him in the UK. He was at the US Embassy yesterday for the anniversary of Guantanamo Bay, of the opening. I think it was the 22nd anniversary of the opening of Guantanamo Bay, of course, where the US tortured and held indefinitely prisoners of war, just as they have tortured and held indefinitely Julian Assange in recent years. And Kieran, he's off next to Buckingham Palace to do a vigil out there, trying to get the King to pardon Julian Assange, which I think is within his capabilities, our royal monarch, and it would be good if he did. And so good on you, Kieran. He's out there slogging it out in very rough conditions in the British winter. That is all we have time for on Paradigm Shift. See you next week.